Hello, I'm Babu Gogineni. I am in Australia and I am interacting with humanists, rationalists, and also some victims of religion. And I came here to talk to two friends who have been abused when they were children in a particular religious cult. And the Prime Minister of this country recently issued a very moving apology. Let's find out what all this is about. Lara and Steven, thank you very much for accepting my invitation to join me on this show. In October this year, the Prime Minister of your country, he issued an apology to children who are now grown up, some of them already dead. Over 50 years, it seems that the children did not get the attention they deserved when they brought up questions. What is all this about?
On Monday, the 22nd of October, Prime Minister Scott Morrison issued a national apology to all the victims and survivors of institutional child sexual abuse within Australia. That took place in Canberra at Parliament. It was on behalf of the Australian Government for failing to listen to the plights of children and for allowing institutional sexual abuse to go unfettered for many, many years. It was a very beautiful and moving apology. I was present. I had been invited to attend along with Lara and about 400 other people in the Great Hall to listen to the Prime Minister's apology.
So 400 people in the hall? So that's the number of victims over 50 years of institutionalized sexual abuse of children? Or are there more? Are there more outside that hall?
He was apologising to all victims within Australia. There were many, many thousands of them. The people that were invited to attend were just a small representation of that number. The victims were in attendance as well as some of their supporters. I was there as a victim and as a supporter, and Lara was there as a victim and as a supporter.
It was a national apology, and it was relevant to us because we were part of the report of Case Study 29, which was from the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse.
How do we know there were thousands when people don't even talk about it?
About 8,000 people gave a submission to the Royal Commission, and they logged all of them. They recorded all of their calls. Some people wrote submissions. For example, I emailed in. And many of those people, I think about 5,000, also met with a commissioner personally. So there was so many that it was recorded because it was a very formal process, the Royal Commission.
As a foreigner, I do not know what a Royal Commission is. I come from a republic. We have no queen or king. What does this Royal Commission do? What are its powers? Does it only inquire and recommend? Or can it also punish?
The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse was introduced by former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, who made an announcement in 2012 to have a Royal Commission. It's a formal process, very similar to a courtroom. It's presided over by a justice, or justices in this case. It has greater powers than a normal court proceeding. It can compel people to attend and it can compel them to answer questions. But it's balanced with justice. If you provide information that incriminates yourself, it can't be used against you to punish you. So it has no powers to punish people or to put people into prison. What it is fact-finding to understand the scope of an issue. In this case, it was child sexual abuse, so that it can be addressed, it can be fixed, the people can get help. It's under our process in Australia, a letter of patent has to be issued by the governor, which is endorsed by the Queen. In this situation, we had a Queen that signed off on the Royal Commission. We had a governor, another woman, who signed off on the Royal Commission, and at the time we had a Prime Minister, the third woman, who signed off on the Royal Commission. So for the first time in a Royal Commission situation in Australia, we had 3 women that took the lead to do that, and it may not have been possible if any of those roles were filled by men.
What was the composition of the Royal Commission? How did it get constituted? Who was in it?
It was very well balanced. There were 2 lead commissioners, Justice Peter McClellan and Justice Jennifer Coate. And both of them together sat on different case studies and presided along the way. They were supported by assistant commissioners, both male and female, and then they were assisted by counsel, it was called Counsel Assisting the Royal Commission, and they were experienced barristers, QCs or SCs, and they were made up of both men and women. And this created a very even balance right across the Royal Commission, because we're listening, or the Royal Commission was hearing evidence from both men and women, as well as in some cases children. So that balance was found and it was very successful.
Data I have seen says that 16,953 individuals contacted the Royal Commission with complaints. 7,981 survivors of child sexual abuse spoke of their trauma and ordeals to the Royal Commission in 8,013 private sessions. This is mind-boggling, isn't it? The scale of the problem in a country with just 26 million people as population. This is shocking.
The final report contains a section that deals with the breakdown on population, religions, male, female. In the Catholic Church, a lot of the abuse was to boys. In other institutions, it was to females. For example, within sporting institutions, it was females. Within the Jehovah's Witnesses, there was a high proportionate number of female victims. In other organisations, it was almost split 50-50. Off the top of my head, I don't know the exact statistics for that, but it varied from organisation and institution.
Did this inquiry really look only at religion? Because if you have 8,000 victims roughly, 4,400 from the Catholic Church, 1,800 from the Jehovah's Witnesses, that's more than half the complaints. Was it only religion or other institutions as well?
It looked at all institutions, both in sporting areas, also in religions, within accommodation, for example, orphanages, children's home. They looked within the Aboriginal communities, how child abuse was dealt with or handled within those communities. And they also looked within custodial arrangements like prisons.
There was reports that came out, and they were different per religion. For example, one of the reasons why they felt Jehovah's Witness children were affected was because there was no role for women in leadership positions. However, the people want to be heard. The people who are victims and their supporters want to be heard by governments and believed. And that was the relevance of the national apology, because for the first time we were acknowledged and believed and we felt heard. So that's why it was so important to us.
Both of you have had a background in the Jehovah's Witnesses church. You say you've left it. Where are you now? Have you gone to another religion? or have you gone away from all religions?
I was a born atheist. I really never believed, but we were forced to believe, and so I couldn't tell anyone my true feelings. So I escaped and left the religion as soon as I possibly could, which was nearly at the end of my studies. I became a scientist, and I was about 19. So I left when I was able to support myself and when I had an education. And I never really required a belief. It was not important to me to know why I was here or what someone else thought I needed to achieve, even a supernatural thing. It never bothered me. So I've never really been a part of any club except for hiking, cycling, climbing, but a religious or otherwise organisation, I've never been part of one since.
Lara, that leads me to an important question. You were born an atheist. You did not believe in the religion. You did not cooperate in their faith. And yet you ended up being a victim. How did that happen?
That's a good question, because I've got a strong mind, but even as a child, you're very impressionable. And so in a lot of their religious publications, they have graphic pictures of devils, of a scarlet woman, of Armageddon. And so as a child, I felt really scared by that imagery. And also the language. The language was the world was going to end, there was going to be blood, there would be birds eating people that had died after Armageddon. This type of language was very aggressive towards a child. I had to visualise that. And so even though I didn't believe it, there's still a part of you that wants to believe, and there's a part of you that has to believe what your parents are telling you, because you can't imagine your parents would believe in anything that wasn't true. So, you know, there was a big part of me that was indoctrinated. And 3 times a week, we would go twice during the week, once on the weekend, and then we would knock on doors, go door to door, perhaps twice a weekend for 2 to 4 hours. And so this type of mentality was replaying in my mind, and it resulted in night terrors, and it resulted in nightmares, which I'm embarrassed to say sometimes I still get. So it was the indoctrination and this constant repetition. They call it repetition for emphasis, and it worked.
Were you able to get any help to talk about it? Friends, elders in the family?
I didn't tell them. I didn't think that they would recognise it, that they would understand, but perhaps more I was fearful that they would be perhaps concerned that I didn't believe. Because if I revealed to them this much, it might then be a concern for them that I wasn't following the script. So I didn't tell anyone.
Was that your experience too, Steve? At what age did you become a victim?
I was born into the religion of Jehovah's Witnesses. My father was a minister. On the other side, my mother was never involved with the religion. So I had both sides. Mum would encourage Christmas and birthdays. Dad would tell me that they were from Satan, the devil. My parents were married before my father converted to being a Jehovah's Witness. The religion heavily discourages current members from marrying outside of the religion, and those that do often receive a marking talk or restrictions on their ability to engage in congregational activities.
You're allowed, but it's frowned on.
My vulnerability came from believing. I believed what my religious leaders taught. I believed what I read in the Jehovah's Witness Bible. I believed what they wrote in their magazines and books from a very young age. They promised me as a child a panda. They promised me as a child to live forever in a beautiful paradise where everybody would be happy. But no one's there yet. No one has ever achieved those sorts of promises. They're always promises a long way into the future. Lara received the same promises that I did as a child. She was fortunate and saw straight through them. I wasn't fortunate. I believed. That's what made me vulnerable. That's what made me trust my elders, and that's what ultimately put me in a situation where that trust was taken advantage of when I was only young.
Steve, you said elders. Are these elders in the family? Or are these elders in the church? Because in your church, in your former church, the leaders are called elders. Who are you talking about?
In that instance, I'm referring to elders within the church structure, within the religious hierarchy. They were presented to me as a young child as someone to trust, as God's representative, that Jesus had appointed them, that they were fine men, that they could be trusted to go to with any of your problems. And unfortunately, I believed that, which led to me going to one of the religion's high-ranking elders with a problem that I had, and that is what led to my abuse.
How did you respond to your abuse?
It's a complicated story, it's a complicated situation. I've responded differently over the years.
You know, there is the Me Too movement around the world now, where people who have been abused have found the courage, maybe after 20 years, 30 years after the incident, to speak about it, to gain closure, or to speak about it, to warn and protect other vulnerable persons. If you feel that that is the effect your recounting it will have, then please do.
Very good points, helping other people to bring closure. That's what I've been doing for many years now, because I never got closure on my situation. I was 12 when I had decided to approach one of the church's elders to report to him a problem that I had, that I wanted some help on. I tried to talk to my father about it, but I called it a whipping because he used to use a stick. So I decided to trust the instructions from the religion and approach an elder. I was 12 at the time, that put it in 1980, and at that time I was a child, and we were building the Jehovah's Witness Assembly Hall in Melton, Victoria. I was one of the children that was working there. Lara was one of the children that was working there. I was 12, that made Lara 8. That's when I first met Lara. So that's how long we've known each other.
That was the best thing that happened that day.
Yes. I'm 50, and that makes Lara 46, so that's a long time. I wanted to talk to one of the elders that was there because they were not my elders. I chose the highest ranking elder I could. I was able to choose the person to talk to with my problem because he was easy to spot. He had a suit, a tie, he didn't have work clothes on, he wasn't working, and I knew who the person was. So I went up and spoke to him and told him what my problem was. And I had prayed to Jehovah to give me the strength to do that. So I went and spoke to him, and I told him that someone had been touching me, doing rude things to me. And he asked me if I told anyone, and I said I tried to tell my father, but I got a smack. And he asked if I told my mother, and I said my mum's not a Jehovah's Witness. And he said, well, that's a good reason not to tell her. Then he put his arm on my shoulder and walked me into the assembly hall. he asked me what the person had done to me, and then he started to reenact those very things on me. He started to sexually abuse me, and then he raped me. And there was a noise and a disturbance that stopped, and I managed to get away. And outside the assembly hall, there was my new friend who was wondering where I was, and she was there. And the elder came out and saw us both there, and I was embarrassed about what he'd done. I was trying to control myself there. And all I could think of was what had happened. And then he asked who the girl was there, and I wouldn't tell him Lara's name. And he walked closer, and I wouldn't let him go anywhere near her. And then I thought, if I told him that I'm going to tell my mum, then he would go away. So I said to him, I'm going to tell my mum. And Lara said the same thing, that she was going to tell my mum. And we managed to get away. A few days later, I was at my own Kingdom Hall when my congregation elders wanted to talk to me. And I went to the discussion after their church meeting, and there was two things they wanted. One, they wanted me to admit to something that had happened at the assembly hall. And I thought, because they were from Jehovah, that they knew what had happened and I was going to get help. I had been accused of smoking a cigarette. I'd been caught by someone at the assembly hall smoking a cigarette, and I wasn't. And I was able to find out who the person was. It was my abuser. And the elders wanted to know the name of the girl that was there, and I wouldn't tell them. And my father told me to tell them, and I wouldn't tell them. And that night at home, I got a whipping from my dad, to tell, and I wouldn't. The next meeting I was asked again, and I wouldn't tell. And I never told. And I used to get whipped and beaten until that stopped after a while. I never got any help for my abuse. In 2008, many years later, I got to have a one-on-one meeting with my abuser. At that stage, he was the highest ranking leader of the religion in Australia. I was at a convention of Jehovah's Witnesses in Melbourne. It was just him and me in the room, just the two of us. I had some friends that stood outside the room, and I told him who I was, what I'd done, or what he had done, what I'd done about writing to him about the problems. And all he said to me was, I've read your letters. I wrote my first letter when I was 18, just after I was baptised, because I had to do that. One of my church elders told me I need to write to him. I didn't have to go through my dad because I was an adult now. I never kept records of those things because I trusted them. I told the elder what I thought of him, and he asked me if I was going to be back tomorrow, and I said yes. And tomorrow I went to the convention, and my implied invitation to attend any gatherings of Jehovah's Witnesses in Australia was revoked. I wasn't excommunicated, I wasn't thrown out. It was the corporation that banned me from all of their meetings.
And you were not allowed to go back again the next day?
No, I wasn't even allowed to enter. That was me following what I was told by the religion to face my abuser one-on-one, and then him using that position to throw me out of the religion. As I hadn't committed any sins or done anything that I could be disfellowshipped or excommunicated for, he used the corporation to target me. And I've never been back since.
So the legal entity is a corporation?
Yes.
my situation is very different. So nothing happened to me at that time. However, I've got 4 people in my family who were sexually abused by Jehovah's Witnesses as children. My mother, my aunt, my sister, and myself. And just in the last month, we believe a cousin has also been affected, and we can assume that others have been too that we don't know about. So in this situation, my mother and aunt were abused by their father. He was a Jehovah's Witness. They were Jehovah's Witness children. They were brought up that way. And in my sister's situation, she was abused by a different man, not a family member, but a member of the Church of Jehovah's Witnesses, which they call it a kingdom hall or a congregation. And she was abused by a man there. She was 14 and he was 23. And he was new to the country, but nevertheless he was a Jehovah's Witness. He was baptised, as Stephen mentioned before. Baptism is when you go underwater and you make a commitment to God, and Stephen called God Jehovah before. That's why they're called Jehovah's Witnesses. They believe Jehovah is God's name. And then myself, if I take it a step back and talk about my sister, she was abused by a man, like I said, when she was 14 and he was 23, and he had a brother. And he was showing us pornography, and he was supplying us with alcohol, and I'm just a year and a half younger, so I was 13. We were wagging school, and so we became highly sexualised. And he set up for his brother to have sex with me. So I was a child, I was 13, and he was an adult. They were both adults and we were both children. So it's only been the last maybe 2 years that Stephen and I realised that we were really the centre of this problem here in Australia, and we both didn't know it about each other, that these things had happened until the last 2 years. And we find we've got many friends who have got the same problem where they know someone or it happened to them, and we are in these online support groups where every day somebody is joining and saying, I know someone too. You mentioned me too, and this is religion too. It's also a hashtag, religion too. And that's us. We're part of that movement to talk about it.
I have a question, Lara. If abuse happened at home, if 2 women were abused by their parent, how can we call it an institutionalized abuse? Crime it is. It could have been molestation, rape, any of the horrific things that come to our mind. But how is it institutionalized? It happened at home.
That is a great question. And the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse included that in their terms of reference when they said for our church and related matters was part of the terms of reference. And Stephen can tell you more about that. But the way it's institutional abuse specifically with us is that the church took control. And so it was the institutional response. So although in Stephen's case he was abused by, like he said, the leader in Australia, he managed it. The leadership managed what happened to him. As you heard, they kicked him out. They revoked his invitation to attend any further gatherings. And in my case, my father went to the elders and he told them about my sister's abuser. And they handled it. They didn't go to the police. In the Royal Commission case study 29, it actually talks about the fact that they didn't go to the police in any of the 1,800 instances of child abuse that was reported to them since 1950. And so in my father's case, he went to the elders and he went to the police. The elders didn't go to the police. And because I never told anyone and because they didn't take it to the police, it happened to my sister and then it happened to me.
What would the police do?
The police weren't very effective back then, I've got to say. I don't remember being interviewed by them. I don't remember them preventing any relationship between myself and the abuser or his brother. So unfortunately they weren't very effective. But I think if there had been many more of these that had been reported, there would have been a pattern, and they would have gotten organised well before this year, 2018. For me, I mean, this is a quarter of a century ago. And as we knew, many of our friends didn't tell their family or their friends.
For me, it was shame, embarrassment, humiliation, fear. What do? I'd already gone to a man of God with what had happened to me, and then I got raped. There's nowhere else to go after that. The only things that I did was I had just started high school. We had an art class, a pottery class. So I made out of pottery the face of the man. And then I moulded him into a demon. And then I gave him horns, and then I changed the horns to ears like a wolf. And then I put glaze all over it, dirty brown glaze, and baked it in the furnace at school. That was what I did at the age of 12. To lock that up, I've still got it. I still have that sculpture. And I locked that away. They had stopped asking me by that stage who the girl was, Lara. We were able to compare our versions of events. I never told her what happened until a while back. That my abuser, it appears he eventually found out who she was. I spoke to the Royal Commission about my abuse, but I didn't appear before them as one of the people who appear before a commissioner to tell their story. I got involved with the Child Abuse Royal Commission in 2012. I contributed towards the terms of reference. Then the following year and the year after 2013 and 2014, I continued to contribute with information. Then I spent quite a few months, almost 6 months, dealing with a commissioner to help them to interpret the terms of reference in the way I wanted it to be interpreted, to help Jehovah's Witness survivors. I said to them that a lot of abuse within the Jehovah's Witnesses is within the family, but the abuser is an ordained minister of religion. And while the Royal Commission was not looking into abuse within the family, I explained that we don't want you to look at the abuse within the family, we want you to look at the institution's response. The Jehovah's Witness Church, the corporate entity Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Australia, they took control, they micromanaged it, they became owners of it. They said, this child abuse incident, we want to own it, we want to get involved. That makes them liable for it. And they're learning that at the moment in America with case after case of getting involved, compounding the problems. And the Child Abuse Royal Commission agreed in the end with my petition to them on that. I thought there was going to be a couple of hundred cases. I didn't expect there to be over 1,800 victims, with a blending between both family and within the religion. But that's 1,800 case files that the church managed and micromanaged. I was able to go through my own abuse in there, the letters that I wrote, the information that I'd sent to them. There's no records of it anymore within the religion that we're able to find. It didn't surprise me. I'd actually spoke about this matter with a meeting I had with the Australian Federal Police and lawyers for the Royal Commission. And my concern in that was that if the leader of the church is also the owner of the records, is he really going to keep a file on himself? if I was the leader of the religion, I'd destroy anything that was bad against me. There seemed to be a general consensus. Yeah, you don't keep incriminating stuff against yourself. And that was the situation. The Royal Commission were really good because they enabled me to find other people that this same man had abused. And I was in a situation where I had to decide whether to report it to the police after all of these years. I spoke about it with Lara. We spoke about it a few times when we were overseas on a trip over there recently. We spoke about it on the trip we did up to Canberra for the national apology. I brought some of the items that I had that related to my abuse with me up there to try and make the decision. I'd already contacted the police in Victoria about what to do if I want to do something. I got the apology from the Australian government. They actually used the words that we say sorry. It was the say sorry that the government put in their apology.
I don't get it. Why should the Prime Minister apologize when the abuse happened in the church?
Part of the reason why the government is saying sorry, in my belief, is that they could have been more effective. You asked earlier, what was the police response to my abuse, to my father contacting them when the elders did nothing? And I said to you that their response was largely ineffective, and therefore I was then affected. So I think they should have had better systems, they should have had better processes, they should have picked up these things. I mean, there were 1,800 child abuse victims in the Jehovah's Witnesses, none of which were reported to the police. But why didn't the police pick up some signs and signals? Why didn't the schools notice people were behaving strangely? For example, I was wagging school. I don't know if you call it wagging or truanting, but I was wagging about a month, and nobody picked up on why my behaviour had changed. My grades plummeted. I did really badly in my last couple of years at school. I wasn't behaving normally, and no one picked that up. No one sat with me and said, what's wrong? And these were, government institutions that I was visiting, hospitals, schools, other welfare or health centres. No doctor picked it up. Until I was an adult, I was about 26 when I finally had a breakdown. And I had to go to a psychologist for 10 sessions because I hardly left the house for 2 years, and I couldn't understand how that had happened. It took so long for me to take stock of what had happened and reconcile myself to it. So we appreciate that the government said sorry, and I actually brought a copy of the national apology with me. So I just want to quickly show you what it looks like and read out one of the things. So just this sentence here, this is the national apology to victims and survivors of institutional child sexual abuse. And what I want to read out is, answers your question. It says, we admit that we failed to protect the most vulnerable people in our society from those who abused their power. And this is exactly speaking to what you mentioned earlier. And the second sentence says, our community believed people and institutions who did not deserve our trust, instead of believing the children who did. So that's the second answer to your question, because they believed the religion over the children. And they said sorry, which we appreciate. And actually, Steven and I are both wearing badges from that day, which was just last week, the 22nd of October, for the national apology. And when we were there, we got to meet the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition and the former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, who approved the Royal Commission. And also at the national apology, we got to listen to the entire speech and really get some closure. But also there were some people who couldn't attend, and there were sessions set up throughout Australia for people to listen. And then afterwards we could take this information home, and for those people who couldn't be there, they can actually request one of these official apologies be sent to them.
I was struck by this idea that for you, an apology is enough. in response to a crime. Does that sound reasonable? Is it the correct thing to do? Would that give justice? Should not the church or the head of the church be prosecuted, brought to justice? Is there no responsibility towards the victims and for the rule of law?
Should he be brought to justice? Yes. The apology from the government was apologising for giving them too much power, for believing him, for believing the religions and institutions, for not putting laws in place that listened to the children, that accepted what they were saying. That's the only sorry that a Jehovah's Witness victim is ever going to hear from anybody. The religion will never say sorry. 1,800 victims. They are the only institution in Australia that refused during the Royal Commission to apologise to one single person. They are not sorry. The government is sorry that they've let them get away for so long. And the Prime Minister gave an address when Lara and myself were present in the Great Hall of Parliament. He spoke about holding those institutions accountable that refuse to apologise, that refuse to join the National Redress Scheme. The National Redress Scheme is where victims can make a claim for compensation from the institution, and the government will facilitate that. But part of that includes a monetary payment and a written formal apology. But Jehovah's Witness leaders, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, do not say sorry. Just before the Royal Commission commenced into looking into the religion, one of the leaders got onto the Jehovah's Witness broadcasting TV network and called the allegations apostate-driven lies. After the Royal Commission finished, the media was reporting recently on the findings. The church leaders are up there talking about fake news. Only their website has the news that you need to follow. Only trust them. My response is fake religion. Listen to the Royal Commission. If you don't want to listen to the news, don't want to listen to the religion, listen to the Royal Commission. We got an apology from the Prime Minister, and I'm chasing up my abuser now. I've already met with the police once over it. After their national apology the other day, Lara and myself drove back from Canberra. We had a good chat, made some decisions on what to do. I've contacted the police. I've started to assemble the evidence that I have, including the names of the elders who I told. Some of them have passed away, which is very inconvenient to me, considering they're all younger than my abuser. I was sort of hoping they'd still be alive. But what I'm hoping to do is make it so that he's held accountable for what he did to me. It might be hard, which is why I'm not mentioning his name, because if we go down the area of a criminal prosecution, then that will be for the courts or the police to release that. We have very unique laws in Victoria about revealing certain information which could prejudice a jury or in those areas even before a trial, so the name is not mentioned there. Will I get justice? I don't know. Will he say sorry? I think he could. I actually think he might actually say sorry. Surprisingly enough. It's not based on a gut feeling, it's based on the fact that I know he's on his deathbed. I know I don't have much time. Even the police informed me I don't have much time. The religion of Jehovah's Witnesses, the leaders there have quite a few years ago sorted out the problem of deathbed apologies. They don't accept them. They won't act on them. They don't discipline the people who make those sorts of apologies. So if he does, he can get away with it still.
Can I add to that? So I think we all can accept a genuine apology. if there was a genuine apology, which I don't believe will be forthcoming, then I could accept that as one part of closure.
So you are saying you are so forgiving that you are okay to let it go with an apology.
For one component is the sexual abuse. But there's much more than that, because we've been shunned, extremely shunned by our family and friends. So not only was there the abuse, but afterwards came the shunning. And in some ways that was much more painful, because we were excluded from our family, our friends, our network, everything. I mean, many Jehovah's Witness children are kicked out of home. In my case, I had to choose to leave. He wasn't allowed to enter even the Assembly Hall or the Kingdom Hall again. And that ostracism, that extreme shunning, which has lasted for us over a quarter of a century, has been so much more damaging. So on the one hand, I can accept an apology if it's genuine, which I doubt. But on the other hand, an apology is not enough, because it won't stop this happening to other children. And unless they change their policies, and unless they are brought to justice, legal justice, they won't do that. And unless they are paying for the pain that they have caused, it won't be a negative feedback mechanism. It won't be a sufficient feedback mechanism. So we need to have justice in terms of litigation. So, for example, Steven and I don't just care about our own cases, we care about cases globally. So he mentioned earlier we were travelling, and so, for example, we were travelling to a protest in London, and we went to this protest, which was a 4-day protest in London just about 2 months ago, where we met with others from 15 countries. So we've told you about what happened for 1,800 in Australia, but we also know at least 15 other countries that are experiencing the same problem. I mentioned before New Zealand has got a Royal Commission. Also, in the UK, they currently have ICSA. It's the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. They also are not including the Jehovah's Witnesses. They should, because we know that this is happening the same globally. So it's very important that we speak not just on behalf of both of our cases and our families and what happened to us, but actually we're just typical. We're just normal former Jehovah's Witnesses that this has happened to. This is not unusual. Our stories are very much replicated throughout the world.
Lara, you have been shunned, excommunicated, punished through exclusion. You were not even believed, and yet you have continued and found yourself again. What gives you the courage?
What gives me the courage is actually people like Steven, because 2 years ago I didn't know what he went through. I didn't know all the work he'd done to get us to the Royal Commission, because before the Royal Commission there were 2 independent inquiries in Victoria. I didn't know that he'd been working for 10 years on things like that. I didn't know all these people that were waiting behind the scenes to support us, that there were online support groups and there were physical meetups. For example, with atheist groups, there's physical meetups where you can get face-to-face support. So I didn't know all these people had done all this work. And when I found out, I was, for the most part, recovered and could help other people, I wanted to do that. So here's a big reason why I'm here and why I want to be a part of what he's started with his submissions to inquiries.
Steven, what would your strategy be at a global level? We know that abuse happened in your church. We also know that in the Catholic Church, 3,000, not victims, 3,000 priests perpetrated atrocities on tens of thousands of victims. how will you bring your expertise, your activism, your insight to bear upon the global situation?
Very complex question. What are my strategies? When I started my activism work, which was just over 10 years ago, I didn't have a strategy. I didn't have a goal. The Victorian government passed child protection laws, the first of their kind in the world.
So your area of work has expanded. It's not Victoria, it's Australia, and not just that, it's Europe and the US. So a lot is happening. But tell me one thing, are you happy with the recommendations of the Royal Commission? I'm not. I thought some of them were hesitantly made, not robustly articulated, and even pleading in some cases. How ridiculous that the Royal Commission, made of judges, should say to the local Catholic corporation or entity in this country that they should request the Holy See to change the canon law. Whereas Australia is a sovereign country. Yes, you have the Queen, but it's a sovereign country which can make its own laws. And yet, the Royal Commission is requesting a religious entity to request its superiors in another country to act. How absolutely absurd.
It is a continuation of the failure of the institutions. I'm not going to defend the government, but I'll give another viewpoint. If the government, like for example the state of Victoria where we are, if they ask the religions to follow the recommendations and the religions say no, then the government can say, we tried, now we're going to pass a law forcing you to do that. And that's what's now happening in jurisdictions, South Australia, Tasmania. They're passing laws that are designed to force the religions to comply with those recommendations. In Victoria, we've passed a number of laws that have circumvented what the religions were claiming, like the Catholic Church, for example. A child abuse victim by the name of John Ellis grew up, became a lawyer, and he sued the Catholic Church for his abuse. And that went all the way through our legal system. What he had done was something quite interesting, because he sued an organisation that did not exist as a legal entity. So the Catholic Church defended itself and said, we can't sue or be sued, we don't exist. But we do know the Catholic Church exists, we can see their churches. That became what's called the Ellis defence. You can't sue an entity or a person that doesn't exist under law. Like a babysitting club, that's not a registered organisation, you can't sue them. The Working with Children laws in Victoria circumvented that by saying you could sue the Committee of Management. But in John Ellis's case, he tried to sue the Catholic Church and it was found it didn't exist. Lara and myself had the opportunity recently in Canberra to meet with John Ellis and to talk a little bit about his experience. And that was a great opportunity. But back to when these laws are passed now, the Jehovah's Witnesses were given a lot of recommendations. For example, Justice McClellan described the practice of shunning child abuse victims, like Lara and myself, as cruel. And it really is. It's cruel on the victim and it's cruel on the person who's forced to shun, because if they don't, they will be shunned themselves. The religion has stated they are not going to change their policies and procedures. Their two-witness rule, where I'm required by the religion to produce 2 witnesses to the event, But the Royal Commission recommended they drop that two-witness rule. The Royal Commission recommended they get women involved within child abuse matters. The leaders of the church said, we can't, it's the Bible. But the Church of Jehovah's Witnesses is saying, we deal with sin, the courts deal with crime. My solution is, well, let the elders handle the sin and let the women get involved with reporting the crime. They don't cross, there's no overlapping. But that's not acceptable to the leaders because the crime ends up being reported. So in some cases, it's not about the two witnesses. It's about not reporting the crime. So with the Jehovah's Witnesses, they won't stop the shunning. So what do? How do we deal with that under law? Lara and myself recently had a meeting with the Australian Human Rights Commission and we discussed the aspects of shunning. Is it possible to legislate against shunning even though it's freedom of religion and that's protected under United Nations freedom rights? Well, those rights can be limited if it creates a health risk or emotional and psychological harm to people. For example, in Australia, they've banned female circumcision. Young Jehovah's Witness children who need a blood transfusion can get a court-ordered blood transfusion straight away to circumvent their religious teachings. We don't allow child brides, even though all of those practices can come under freedom of religion. But what we need to do is create an empirical study that shows the effects of shunning on people, how it emotionally hurts them, how it creates harm, how it's a danger to their health. And once we establish that, then the legislators can address it. And that's why when there's recommendations made to religion and religion turns their nose up at them, there are people behind the scenes, like ourselves, that are working around how can we make the state safer? How can we make it more better for children? So it's great in some instances they refuse the recommendations, but it would be good if they just voluntarily adopted them. It would make it easier. We wouldn't have to fight.
Can I answer your question in another way? So your question being, how is it that the recommendations seem so weak? And in some ways, we're just so grateful that we had the Royal Commission. It changed our lives. Not only our lives, but the other people that watched it around the world changed their lives as well. So from that perspective, we'll take anything we can get. But yes, I absolutely believe that the religions have too much power. And I think that's part of the problem and why you might think the recommendations are weak. They've still got a lot of power. I mean, they're thousands of years ahead of us because they were in charge first. And so we have to show people that harm that you just described and actually do scientific studies so that people can see for themselves which is a better way to live. Because we know that people of different religions, there have been many wars as a result of the different origins. For example, you're usually whatever religion your family is. We're Jehovah's Witnesses because our families were Jehovah's Witnesses. We probably would have been Catholics if they were Catholic. And so this is inherited, but the power is also inherited. And so, we were lucky to have our Royal Commission. But in time, with these laws, and we're very lucky in Victoria as well, because specifically here, we really have a nanny state. And so cultivating those laws that work for us, where we can move the shift of power to be more balanced, is very important. But also is talking to the other countries. Like I said at the protest, there were 15 countries represented. Now they're looking at us and they say, well, can we have a Royal Commission? And then can we change our laws to also get that protection, that level of protection? So it's going to take some time, and I'm just as frustrated as you. But I'm very lucky we've lived through this to at least have had this opportunity. We didn't have it before the Royal Commission.
And many children might be lucky that you have acted because they now benefit from your activism, even though they come from the same vulnerable category that you once belonged to. While you were talking, you said somewhere you lost faith. You lost all faith? Faith in Jehovah? Have you found another God? What are the values that guide you today?
It was 2011. In February 2011, I wrote a poem to try and heal myself. And when I read back on my poem that I'd wrote, just in one day, in one sitting, it ran to about 6 pages, it was lengthy. I don't read poetry, so writing a poem was really foreign to me. I did my best. I realised in there that I had stated that I had trusted in God and I'd followed God's guidelines, and then he wasn't there for me. And that made me sit back and think, why? Why? And I discovered in my poem that I'd spoken about believing in God as a child. And I recognised that I was lied to as a child. Liking evidence to make my decisions, I took a rational, scientific approach to what I'd always accepted as fact. I examined my religion, and stripping back the veneer, it was a whitewashed grave. But there was something that struck me very, very powerfully. And it was an incident that had occurred when I was in my teens, and I was looking through one of the Jehovah's Witness books or publications, and it showed a picture of Shiva, and it showed a picture of other Hindu gods. And they had many hands, some of them had many heads looking this way, that way. Then I was looking at them going, that is just weird. No wonder they're false religion. The next page, there were Greek gods of mythology. There was animals with human bodies, or there were humans with animal heads, like in Egyptian mythology. And I looked at that and I went, that's just crazy. No wonder they're false religion from my childhood. And a few days later, I was looking through a Jehovah's Witness publication called Revelation Climax. And in there were pictures that the leaders of the church had put into the magazine, taken from the Bible, our teachings. There were animals with human heads. There were angels with 4 different animal faces. There were talking snakes, talking donkeys. And I sat there and I looked at it and I went, what? The very thing my entire life I'd laughed at other religions about, particularly Hindu faiths, my own faith had the exact same teachings. It was just a little bit different. A horse with a scorpion's tail. I started tracking through mythology. This was evident everywhere. So I took a step back and went, okay, something's not right. I'll take the scientific approach. And I read through the first book of the Bible from a scientific angle after having not read the Bible for quite a number of months. Genesis chapter 1, and it struck me straight away. The creation, it was not in scientific order. God created the sun, and on the first day, the sun rose. But plants were already in existence. So how was the plants already on the planet without the sun? And I had to sit there and come up with a rational explanation for myself. And all I could come up with was that the nation of Israel that Moses was a part of, their day started when the sun rose in the morning. So when the sun rose, the plants and animals were already there. So that just made it into God's version of creation, which was completely backwards. And bit by bit, I looked at my religious beliefs and compared them against the facts and the evidence. And then I was able to take that and say, I trusted Jehovah when I was a child. I trusted him to do the right thing when I was 12. And I got abused. I got raped because I followed what he said. I trusted him. And these people are his representatives. And that started to eat away. and I lost my faith in God. I didn't lose my morals and ethics, just my religious convictions. And it was only earlier this year, Lara and myself had been meeting with humanists, rationalists, secularists, atheists, giving presentations, learning about how they believe, what they teach. And we came across rationalists and we read about rationalism. And Lara sat there reading it out loud to me. First it was Wikipedia, then it was the Rationalist Society of Australia, their interpretation of it. And we just looked at each other and just went,
We're rationalists.
We're rationalists. Bang, just like that. There's nothing to believe in. There's no rituals or anything like that. It was just, that's actually what we have evolved in from being raised as Jehovah's Witnesses all through to that process. It was liberating, but it helped us give an answer to what we've become when we probably were there a long time ago. I'd left the religion when I was 27 and then came back 7 years later, try and get my brother out. So I was sort of swaying backwards and forwards, but had this overarching spirituality, but that was because I believed in Jehovah. But to be hurt by following his guidelines sort of shatters that approach, like finding your dad's not your dad.
Steven and Lara, I'm very grateful to you that you found the time, but more than that, you had the willingness to share deeply traumatic incidents and experiences of your life. But we doing this so that we can warn others and we can tell others that if they stand for their rights, justice can be done. And for having cooperated in that, I'd like to thank you on behalf of Progressive Atheists of Australia and the South Asian Humanist Association. In my own country, in communities I am close to, faith has created many victims, many of them the kind that you have been. And I hope that this experience of not just suffering, but of responding to abuse, of fighting impunity with human rights, will be inspiring to people in other countries and in other situations. Thank you very much. Belief, faith. You can believe based on facts, but faith does not require facts. Faith is often irrational, and where there is irrationality, there is also damage to human values and rights. In this excruciating, harrowing narration of personal tragedy, one thing stands out. Little children were told not to question the elders. Little children were told God would protect them when bad people did something to them. Forget not that it was the bad people who were telling them that. They used religion and God as a cover for their nastiness, for their abuse of other human beings. This is a warning to us. It's also an inspiration that in Australia, a few activists were able to instigate, unlike Stephen, even help create the terms of reference of a Royal Commission's institution, operation, inquiry, and recommendations. So if a few people who are determined not to allow their abuse of their rights, the destruction of their dignity, then the wicked will not win. Do not get lost in these ideas of sin. These are crimes. The punishment for your sins will not be in the afterlife. It has to be now, here, and in a fair way. I hope those who are watching this, who have watched this, have been able to get that message. Near you, in a different faith community, there might be a different kind of exploitation. Do not wait for God to help them. You are there, maybe you can help them. Maybe you should tell the police. Maybe the local Human Rights Commission. Maybe you should bring the local psychiatrist to talk to a child, a grown-up, an old person who seems lost or is behaving different to their earlier personality. Help them. Use reason, not religion.